Okay, for our last topic, we're going to look at an application problem, and then we're just going to fill in a separate table where we practice converting between percent, decimal, and fraction form. Okay, so for example 6, it says answer the questions based on the pie chart. So question 1 says write the paper cost as a decimal. So we have to figure out which pie in this pie chart represents the paper cost. Well, it's this nice green pie piece right here. And we are told that the paper cost for whatever this situation is, the paper cost is 25%. So in order to write 25% as a decimal, we want to drop the decimal point, and then we move our decimal to the left twice. Remember, if you don't specifically see a decimal, assume it's at the end of the number. So after the 5 would be the decimal. We move it to the left twice, and that gives us 0.25. So for whatever this pie chart represents, the cost of some company, the paper cost is 0.25 or 25%. Okay. For part B, it says find basically the royalty percent, and we want to write the royalty percent as a fraction. Well, the royalty percent is right here. It's this kind of teal blue color, and we're looking at 15%. So we want to say, okay, we've got 15%. In order to write this as a fraction, we drop the percent symbol, and then we put whatever the number is over 100, and we simplify. Okay? Now, you can simplify several ways, or not several, but you can use your calculator. You have to show the setup. Okay, we have to know that you understand that you drop the percent symbol and you put the 15 over 100. Then you can let your calculator reduce it if you have a calculator that'll reduce fractions, or you can reduce this by hand. So I know that if numbers end in 5 or 0, they're divisible by 5. So let's start by dividing top and bottom by 5. Well, I know that 15 divided by 5 is 3. And if you're not sure what 100 divided by 5 is, you could certainly use a calculator to do the side work, but 100 divided by 5 is 20. So there we have it. We have written the royalty percent as a fraction. And then part C is a true-false question. It says the binding percent equals 1/5 in fraction form. Well, let's see. So we can see here that the binding percent is this purple pie piece, and the binding percent is 20%. So we're going to take 20% and we're going to write it in fraction form, and we're going to see if it really does equal 1/5. So we drop the percent symbol, and then we put 20 over 100. And let's say you're not sure if these two things are going to simplify nicely. I can tell you that if something ends in 0, it's divisible by 10. So let's start there. So we could say, okay, 20 ends in 10, and 100, or 20 ends in 10, 20 ends in 0, and 100 ends in 0. So let's divide them both by 10. That's an easy place to start. 20 divided by 10 is 2. 100 divided by 10 is 10. So are we fully reduced at this point? Not quite. Both of these numbers are even. And remember, if a number is even, it's divisible by 2. So we could take this one step further and divide the numerator and denominator by 2. Well, 2 divided by 2 is 1. 10 divided by 2 is 5. We do indeed get 1/5. So we would say that this was true. Okay, now you didn't have to simplify this fraction this way. Some students would recognize that 20 goes into 100 5 times, therefore you get 1/5. You could certainly use a calculator to reduce. I just wanted to do this one to remind you that if you can't see the greatest common factor right off the bat, like we did in part B, we saw that 5 is the greatest common factor, and we were able to just divide numerator and denominator one time. That was great. In some cases, if you can't find the greatest common factor when you're dividing out or simplifying a fraction, just as long as you find a common factor, you can divide it out, and then you keep repeating that process until you get something that is truly reduced. Okay, so either way you slice it, get these fractions reduced. So there you have it. We've looked at this pie chart or circle graph. Sometimes you'll see it called that. We were able to pull some information from that chart and basically play around with converting between decimal, percent, and fraction form. Now, the last example for this worksheet, we're going to do exactly the same thing. It says fill in the table with the missing values, round to the nearest hundredth as needed. Okay. So we have three columns to this table, one for percent form, one for decimal form, and one for fraction form. And then we have three rows, and each row is going to represent a different problem. Okay. So the first row, we have 12.5%. We need to convert it into decimal and fraction form. For row two, we have 1.25 as a decimal. We need to write it as a percent and as a fraction. And then finally, we have 5/6 as a fraction. We need to convert it to percent and decimal form. So we're just going to fill in the table with the correct format of each number in each row. Okay? So for the first row, we have 12.5%. Converting this to decimal form is going to be pretty easy. We want to take our 12.5%. We're going to drop the percent symbol. And then remember, to go from percent to decimal, we move the decimal to the left twice. So that's really division by 100. We get 0.125. And technically the directions here say round to the nearest hundredth as needed. If we were going to do that, we don't really need to do that since this one terminates really nicely, but if we did like explicitly follow the directions, we would look at this 2. Directly to the right of that, we have a 5, which tells us to round up. So we would say this technically rounds to 0.13, but ordinarily, if I have a decimal that terminates as 0.125, I would prefer to use the full exact 0.125 than to round it, but we're following the directions, so we're going to do what they say. Finally, for the fraction column, we want to take 12.5% and write it in fraction form. So we take the 12.5%. Remember, we drop the percent symbol, and then I can put, well, let me go back to the black marker. Then I can put 12.5 over 100. Okay, and so in this case, if you have a calculator that can reduce fractions for you, you could just go straight to the calculator right here and try to reduce it. If you don't have a calculator that reduces fractions for you and you have to kind of reduce this kind of by hand with merely the assistance of a calculator, what you would want to do is start by multiplying top and bottom by 10. Multiplying the top by 10 will turn the numerator into a whole number. It'll no longer have a decimal, so we would get 125. The deal is if I multiply the top, I have to multiply the bottom because hopefully you kind of remember this. If I multiply the top and bottom of a fraction by the same number, it's really just like multiplying by a weird form of 1. So even though we're changing the appearance of the fraction, we're not actually changing its value. We're just we're getting to a point where something's a bit more useful to us, okay? So when I multiply my denominator by 10, I get 1,000. And we think these are at least divisible by 25. They both might be divisible by 125. Let's go to the calculator and play around. So we can say we're going to see if they're both divisible by 125. We'll just have to see what the calculator tells us. You can do this by hand if you want to, but for the sake of time in this video, I'm going to use the calculator to do the side work. So from the calculator, we know 125, the numerator, is certainly divisible by itself, but is 10,000 or is 1,000 divided divisible by 125? If we get a whole number, it is divisible. If we get a decimal, it's not. And we get a whole number. So what that tells me is when I take my 125 over 1,000, let's go back to the worksheet. When I take my 125 over 1,000, I can divide top and bottom by 125. Well, 125 divided by itself is 1, and 1,000 divided by 125 is 8. So this reduces to 1/8. And if you're unsure of if this is true, you can go back to your calculator. We know that we had 1/8. So let's see what 1/8 is as a decimal. Well, it's 0.125, which is exactly what we would expect because remember, we started by converting our percent to a decimal. We can also check 125 divided by 1,000. We want to make sure it divides out and has the decimal form of 0.125, and it does. And remember, we started out by converting our percent to a fraction by taking 12.5 and dividing it by 100. Hopefully we get the same decimal, and we do. So those three fractions, 1/8, 125 over 1,000, and 12.5 over 100, all really truly do equal the decimal form of that percent, which was 0.125. Okay? Let's go to the next one. So for the next row, we have the decimal form of some number, and it is 1.25. So what we want to do is convert this to a percent first. That's going to be the easy one. So we take 1.25. Technically, we need to multiply it by 100, which really just moves my decimal to the right twice. So that gives me 125, and then I have to remember to add my percent symbol, okay? If you don't add your percent symbol, you cannot say these two things are equal. 1.25 is not equal to 125. 1.25 is equal to 125%, okay? Now, as far as converting this to a fraction, it does specifically say a fraction. It does not say a mixed number. So I'm going to take my 125%, so 125%, I'm going to drop my percent symbol, and then I'm going to put 125 over 100. And they should both be divisible by 25. I like to sometimes think of money. Think of this as like $1.25 and a dollar. They're both divisible by a quarter, like the coin a quarter. So let's see if they're divisible by 25. Well, 125 divided by 25, if you need your calculator to assist you in this, that's fine. Let the calculator do the side work. 125 divided by 25 is 5, and 100 divided by 25 is 4. And so we do get an improper fraction, and that should kind of make sense because if I were, and I'm not asked to do this, but if I were to write this as a mixed number, I would get 1 and 1/4. So this 1 means we have one whole. And remember, when you're dealing with a percent, a whole is 100. So this represents like 100%, and then this represents some portion of 100 or 25%. So we get our 125% this way. So it would make sense that you would get an improper fraction here. Okay, last up, we have 5/6, and we need to write it as a percent and as a decimal, and they're both going to take us about the same amount of work. And I do want you to be really careful here. The technical directions do tell us to round to the nearest hundredth, and that can be a little weird when you're talking about a decimal versus a percent. So we're going to do both of these, and we're going to round each of them individually to the nearest hundredth, and it's going to make our answers look slightly different-ish, but they're both rounded. Just keep that in mind. So let's start with the percent. You have two ways that you can write a fraction as a percent. You can take the fraction and write it as a decimal and then convert your decimal to a percent, or you can use the proportion. And I kind of like the proportion because if you get some weird values, the proportion, it just sort of works itself out. It also gives us a reason to practice using proportions, okay? So if you remember, we take whatever our fraction is and we set it equal to the percent, which I'm just going to call P for now, over very specifically 100. So when I cross multiply, I get 6P equals 5 times 100, which we know is just 500. I divide both sides by 6. Well, the 6's divide out to just be 1, leaving me with P. And P is equal to 500 divided by 6. So let's go to the calculator. So 500 divided by 6 is 88.33333. Okay, so let's go to the calculator. Let's go to the worksheet and round this. So what our calculator gave us was 83.333 repeating. Okay, well, the directions here say round to the nearest hundredth, which would be this second 3 after the decimal point. To the right of that, we have a 3, which tells me to round down. So we would say this is approximately 83.33%. Okay? Now let's convert this to decimal format. And you can use either the percent or the fraction to convert to decimal format. It just kind of depends. So if we have 83, well, let me write it as 83. If we have 83.33%, we can go ahead and use this to convert to our decimal format. We drop the percent symbol and we move our decimal to the left 3 times. Or, Lord, we move it to the right or to the left 2 times. Gracious, don't move it 3 times, move it twice. I've got 3 stuck in my head because of all the 3's in this answer. So we move our decimal to the left twice, which makes this 0.8333. But remember, the directions said round to the nearest hundredth. So if we rounded our decimal form to the nearest hundredth, we would just get 0.83. So these kind of feel a little bit different because we took our percent and converted it to a decimal, but when we round, we kind of get this weird situation where both of them have 2 decimal places, but they may not feel exactly equal because 83.33% should be 0.8333, however many threes. And we knocked a couple of those threes off. So it may feel a little bit weird, but this is what happens when you round. A lot of times, if you're dealing with decimals and percents, you may have directions that say round to the nearest hundredth or round like your percents. They may say round to the nearest hundredth of a percent. So you may have different directions depending on if you're dealing with percents or if you're dealing with decimals. But here we are. This was our process. So make sure you understand the difference between decimals, fractions, and percents, and certainly know how to convert between the two or between the three, really.